Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to see you here at this hybrid event. I'm Mike Savage. I'm Professorial Research Fellow at the International Inequalities Institute, and I convene. It's a very important research which a number of us in this room are conducting on the theme around wealth, elites, and tax justice, which is exactly the topic of Sarah's book today. And I'm really pleased to have a great panel to discuss this exciting and hugely topical piece of work. So Rajiv, Prabhakar, Armine, Ishkanian, and Frank Sudin. And indeed, just to say, I mean, I can't imagine a book which is more topical, given what's going on in the world in recent weeks. We see, the world's wealthiest man marauding around the planet, hand in hand with another wealthy man. I'm not quite clear how wealthy he really is, but he's certainly carries on and said he's very wealthy. So the whole topic of this book about thinking about what it means to see wealth as a social problem is really fundamental one, which we are committed to addressing. And I'm so excited, having seen Sarah working on this book over recent months, to see, this is a really big picture piece of social science, much needed. And it's very exciting to be able to chair this book launch for it. So Sarah is currently a research fellow at the International Inequality Institute, and her new book, as you can tell, is Wealth, Poverty and Enduring Inequality. Let's Talk Wealtherty. She completed her PhD at UCL on this topic, on this theme, a couple of years ago, and she's been working with us at the LSE since then. An amazing panel. Rajiv Prabhakar is Senior Lecturer in Personal Finance at the Open University. He's author of the book Financial Inclusion, Critique and Alternatives, and he's one of the leading experts in the UK around questions around taxing wealth. Between April 2021 and October 2022, he was a Parliamentary Academic Fellow at the House of Commons Library. Armine Ishkanian is Professor in the Social Policy Department here at the LSE. She's also Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Programme, really flagship programme, one of the LSE's proudest programmes of work, doing exciting and innovative work, thinking about broadening the academic curriculum and reach beyond the conventional academic student body. So this is the kind of initiative which we're really concerned to develop and support, given the problems of the world we face. Her research focuses on the relationship between civil society and democracy, development and social transformation. And finally, Frank Sudin leads Joseph Rowntree Foundation's public engagement, advocacy and campaigning work. Prior to this appointment, he held a series of campaigning, policy and influencing roles at JRF, the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission, the Nuffield Trust, the Royal College of Physicians and Alcohol Concerns. It's an amazing panel which covers many areas of expertise, and I think is perfectly positioned to discuss this book. So the plan will be for Sarah to introduce her book in 20 minutes, and then each of the panel members will have 10 minutes. That should leave about at least half an hour for questions and comments, discussion from the floor. The event is being recorded and will be made available as a podcast. We've got an online audience as well as an audience in the room. So it's going to be a great hour and a half ahead of us. Let's pass on to Sarah.
Brilliant. Good evening. Thanks for coming, everybody. And thank you for the introduction, Mike. And thanks to Peter and Emma and the International Inequalities team for their great work in organising it. I'm really appreciative of that. So the book I'm going to be talking about tonight is an ideas book. It takes the form of a genealogy. And that's an approach to history writing developed by Michel Foucault. And it has a particular structure. It tells histories of now. And it starts with a problem posed in the present, then asks how we got here, what sustains that problem. That is, what institutions, practices and norms keep it in place. And finally, it asks how we can change it. So that's the structure I'm going to follow tonight as well. And I just want to flip back. I've left this image here without comment to start with, but I'll return to it as we progress through the presentation. So a genealogy is often prompted by the recognition of an area of shared social concern. And I think it's fair to say that since the turn of this century, and certainly since the 2010s, wealth inequality has been evolving into such an area of shared social concern. When I started the research for what became this book back in 2015, things were very different. Sorry, I've got a very dry mouth, so I'm just going to take a sip. And it's hard to imagine quite how different the landscape was in terms of the sociological study of wealth inequality or the campaigning landscape in relation to wealth and other forms of inequality. So here are some organisations that weren't around when I started, and they're really familiar to us now. Or organisations that have taken a pivot and have a renewed focus on wealth and wealth inequality. And some data was only newly available. So the Office for National Statistics Wealth and Assets Survey, first wave, was in 2006, 2008. So the first books and the first articles were only just coming out at this time. And ditto the World Inequality Report, although the lab had been up and running for a while, these landmark reports had only just started being published. And social policy scholarship by people like Karen Rowlingson, Sharon Wright, Michael Orton and others were only years old. They started really their focus on wealth and fiscal welfare in the first decade, the end of the first decade of the 2000s, sorry. Yeah. So social policy was still primarily looking down. And by that, I mean focusing on poverty and on poor people. And there wasn't much about the need to look up, and there certainly wasn't much actually scholarly looking up at that moment in the social policy space. So this by way of saying things have changed and are changing. We are starting to look up, and this is really hopeful. I'm very pleased about it. I think wealth inequality is an area of shared social concern. I think it's also fair to say that not everybody shares that concern. And indeed, the problem of low political and public salience for the problem of extreme wealth occupies the time of many of us in the room this evening. Why don't people and politicians care about it more? And why aren't they at the barricades demanding an end to surplus wealth? So my aim over the next 20 minutes or so is to make the case for the idea of wealtherty, which is the subtitle of my book, and for rich descriptive work on wealth inequality more generally, not as an alternative to the careful quantitative work that many of my colleagues in this room do on wealth inequality, but as a necessary partner. So as I said, genealogy starts with a question of what have we become? And without wishing to bring everybody down right at the beginning, things aren't looking good in the UK and in other rich nations. And in the next 20 minutes, if we think about it as a graph, I think we'll hold shocking and depressing facts as a constant all the way through. And I'll be trying to spark an upward curve of hope, but it might be at the last minute. So you might need to brace yourselves if we're bumpy ride. What have we become? We have become very poor. So this is a graph that looks at the slide of wealth into private hands. So the line's going down a public wealth and the line's going up a private wealth. And it makes the point that in UK, public wealth dropped from 60% of national income to minus 106% in between 1970 and 2020. And we have high levels of individual poverty, as the recent JRF 2025 poverty report shows. 2 in 10 adults are in poverty, 3 in 10 children. And of those people in poverty, an increasing percentage are in deep or very deep poverty being less than 40% of the median income in the UK. So the state is poor, individuals are poor. And the lack of assets available to the public purse does give some practical legitimacy to the claim that there are difficult choices to be made, which is a refrain that we hear a lot. Although that's a set of language that I do think we need to interrogate a bit more. I'm happy to return to in the discussion. Sorry, Emma. At the same time, we're also really rich. And you don't necessarily need to see the detail of this graph, but it's a classic wealth inequality graph. And these groups at the bottom for non-social scientists in the room are deciles, so tenths of the population. And these are the amounts of wealth you hold that are typically held. So the blue line in the yellow column denotes the minimum wealth within that group. And just as a totally non-economist aside, If we were to use this axis, the vertical axis, to describe just the bottom 50%, each of those little increments at the side would only need to be £10,000. And this column here would need to be 1.5 meters tall. So we're literally not on the same page. This graph is representing wealth because it needs to fit this massive slicing at the top. And at the bottom, it's obviously much more sparse. So we don't all have some of the wealth. Within the headline figures, different groups, specific generations, women, people from many non-white ethnic groups have a lot less. And although wealth inequality is stable, we feel further apart because the amount of wealth has grown and the gap between these deciles is bigger. There's no prospect of us earning our way up to the next one. We don't feel like we're playing the same game, and we sometimes don't even feel like we're on the same pitch. So we're deeply divided. I really feel like I am the downer today. I hope other people have some hopeful things to say shortly. We're deeply divided. Some people are rich and others are poor. And some of these patterns reproduce historical relationships of exploitation seeded in colonial and patriarchal relations. Women continue to own less wealth than men. Non-white ethnic groups typically own less than white ethnic groups. Our media and politics is polarized and polarizing, fueling narratives that pitch one disenfranchised group against another. And trust in government is low. There's no conviction that government wants to or can do anything about wealth inequality. So I'm just going to a quote from our participant in a focus group that Michael and I ran as part of some work we've been doing with Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's a project on framing wealth. And this participant said, "It's just not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. It's not going to be for us people, working class people. We're not going to go up the line any much further. There's no way out, basically. I can't see a way out of it." So it's easy to feel defeated and it's very hard to feel hopeful. So I can definitely sense that the upward curve of optimism isn't quite hitting yet. You have to bear with me. So what does all this amount to? I propose in my book, all this poverty, wealth and inequality amounts to something that I've called wealtherty. And as statistician George Box says, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And wealtherty is a conceptual tool that aims to be useful. It seeks to flesh out something with the equivalent social ontological status as poverty. Its assumption is that articulating the problem of extreme wealth in a diffuse, descriptive way can make way for a fuller range of measurements, solutions, and policy and civic responses. And it makes the case, which isn't a new one, that wealth inequality isn't just a distributional issue that we can trace in graphs and seek to reduce through income and wealth compression or taxation. It's something, the harmful social effects of which we need to learn to see. For example, the dignity deficit articulated by Michael Sandel and Thomas Piketty recently, which might require other forms of recognition, measurement and redress, like Sandel's proposition for the building and rebuilding of civic spaces. So the focus of wealtherty is on the norms, practices and institutions that work today to reproduce and sustain historical inequalities and to propel them into the future. So I'm going to sketch out 4 intersecting components broadly to do with law and policy, identities and divisions, power and influence, and knowledge making and knowers, or knowledge and knowing. So the first one, law and policy, takes as given the hyper-concentration of wealth. We know there's a stark polarization between the richest and the poorest, and that the distribution renews these older relationships of exploitation. But this facet is about the legal code and the effective institutional strategies that enable this hyper-concentration. The second, on identities and divisions, is about the social and policy divisions that have evolved over time based on the distinction between richer and poorer people. Hence, social policies, the conception of the social tends to be poorer people, and the concerns of rich people tend to be dealt with in fiscal policy and taxation. And we get this mirrored in the terms that we see in the media around the difference between customers and claimants, and a reinforcement of that polarizing in media identities. So we have value creators versus scroungers and so on. So this facet is about governing richer and poorer populations differently. Power and influence. richer people are able to access a restricted set of activities or capabilities. This is what Ingrid Robbins talks about in her work on libertarianism, when she's talking about the bleed between financial and other forms of power, specifically political power. So richer people can access this restricted set of privileges, including buying and setting media agendas. And we only need to look at what's going on over the pond at the moment in the US government to be witnessing this. And they can donate to and lobby political parties and dominate political discourses and agendas. And then finally, knowledge and knowing is around the gatekeeping of knowledge resources. So the rich actively shape how we make collective knowledge, not just through the buying of the media agendas, but gatekeeping who gets to know what constitutes knowledge, such that the ascendancy of wealth and the wealthy can't rationally be questioned within the terms of debate that the wealthy themselves have set. So that's my kind of sketching out of wealtherty as a description of the state we were in. So as part of genealogy, the second question that you ask is, how have we become what we are? So we've identified the state we are in, and then it's about looking back to other historical moments to recognise the emergence of these currents. And in my work, I've identified this as different dispositions of government. And to be clear, my work's primarily focused on the UK. I do make the case that it's applicable to other rich nations with very poor populations, but the policy context that I've analysed historically is a UK policy context. So I've looked at wealthy governmental dispositions, wealthy governmental dispositions of ignorance and scrutiny. Ignorance is the governmental disposition of the state towards richer people, and it ramifies in a lack of interest in knowing about financial affairs. And it tends to accommodate, ignore, and enable. And this is evident in reports from the National Audit Office and chapters that Adrian Sinfield and colleagues have written around tax expenditure. And it results in these behaviours, secrecy basically. It sanctions and enables secrecy and privacy. It allows a refusal to be known and observed, and it allows people to withhold and hide. And this is something that's accreted over time. It's a settling disposition that kind of inhabits institutions. On the other side, scrutiny, for social policy scholars who look at contemporary social policy, this will feel familiar, but this is about the imperative on the part of the state to observe and to know, and to scrutinise and to administer. And on the part of poorer people, this is disclosure. It's assent to being known and disclosing and showing. And this is something that the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in 2018, when he visited the UK, he talked about this as being a case of total surveillance, and he himself likened it to historical incidences around similar currents during the workhouse period in the early 1800s. So this is the start of how we've become what we are, and I've just realised I haven't read any of my notes, so apologies if I've missed anything out. So these begin to consolidate over time, and we can see them in the late 1700s, in the 1800s, and we can see them in the institutions of the state now. So the final part of genealogy asks what sustains the problem? What are the continuing practices and institutions that keep this in place? And in the book, I've explored three primary means of sustaining the problem. And the first is narratives produced by some think tanks that materially shape policy that helps keep wealtherty in place. And I focused in the book on the Centre for Social Justice as an example. I'm not suggesting that they are the only think tank that creates narratives like this, as a bit of a disclaimer there in case they're watching. So the marketisation of knowledge generally post-Thatcher has enabled private interests to express and lobby for their policy preferences. So it's quite hard to think about what the knowledge-making landscape around policy was pre-Thatcher, but think tanks were really not a thing in terms of being sources for policy ideas and policy making. Civil servants did that job. So the marketisation happened quite rapidly. And if you kind of trace it and graph it over time, it consolidates very rapidly. And the networks around these think tanks grow and people kind of move between them. So CSJ published two landmark reports in 2006, 2007, Breakdown Britain and Breakthrough Britain. And they reproduced deeply contested narratives, contested by academic peers, which directly shaped the 2012 Welfare Reform Act, which was hugely punitive. It brought in universal credit and has caused untold harm to already vulnerable populations. So they relied on some of these older stories of worklessness and dependency, and the resultant stigma helped to soften the landscape for the implementation in the UK of austerity more broadly. It kept the focus, by their own admission, away from money. So in agnotology literature, agnotology is a field of philosophy that studies ignorance. It's kind of the mirror set of scholarship to epistemology. Agnotology literature calls this kind of narrative building distraction research or red herring research. My point being that the knowledge paid for by wealthy people, and Centre for Social Justice scores an E on transparency, so we don't actually know who funds the research here, but the knowledge paid for keeps these narratives in place. It delivers fiscal interests for the rich while retaining the respectability of a social justice wrapper, arguably. And the narratives keep us looking down. So problems and solutions in CSJ literature at this time were remarkably both found in the grassroots. So second, I've looked at how richer and poorer people's use of space sustains wealtherty. So the historical work I did was around the workhouses in the late 1700s and the first kind of 30, 40 years of the 1800s. And I've looked at, in the book, I've looked at job centre pluses as kind of contemporary parallels in some ways. But I'm reminded for this image of a comment recently made by political philosopher Michael Sandel about the necessity of shared civic spaces in order to heal the rifts that I talked about earlier that have opened up between social groups. And this is an image of somebody called Salvatore Rea, and he's a social housing tenant in a London block of housing where there are also private tenants, and he's overlooking the children's play area that his children aren't allowed to play in. So he can see it, but they can't actually access it. Now, this example was used last month at the class conference, and somebody pointed out, actually, what happened after this was all the parents got together, said they weren't happy with it, and eventually all the children were allowed to use it. But the fact that spaces like this are built in London, and there are other kind of narratives around buildings with pour doors, etc., it's a very zoned thing. And I've also looked at the disciplinary role that welfare buildings still exert on poorer people in the process of accessing support. So they're not workhouses per se, but they nonetheless divide and regulate. Unlike the workhouses, they play a powerful semiotic role as places where those guilty of the crime of dependency must go in order to seek relief. And I've also critiqued the paucity of critical visual imagery in the media and campaigning. It's a shared interest of my colleague Michael and I in III. That moves beyond images of what wealth looks like for rich people and towards what wealth inequality feels like for the rest of us. And this image here is from this great book, 11 Privatised Public Assets. It's a book of photography by Lewis Bush. And it does what it says on the tin. It's just photographs of stuff that we used to own that's been sold off privately. So this is the BP site that was privatised in 1978. And this is what wealth inequality actually looks like. So this lack of criticality arguably contributes to media framing that fails to compellingly define the problem. And the final thing that I looked at was knowledge hierarchies. And this is evident in how the state communicates with those with low or no wealth and those with lots of wealth in specific policy fora. And I looked at this is the Work and Pension Select Committee inquiry into universal credit and childcare. And the other forum that I looked at was the Wealthy External Forum, which from 2010 has been a meeting place for the representatives of the super rich, so people with 20 million plus in assets, and HMRC. And it's like a private closed door. You can read the minutes, but there aren't any images of it. So in the workhouse era, the first item on the agenda and minuted in workhouse notes is the paupers were called in and questioned. And this was the shift towards them having to make a case for relief from poverty. Now we invite people in to share their lived experience, often with deeply uncomfortable parallels. So this is, like I say, an image of women claiming universal credit and trying to claim childcare. And it's worth watching. This is Gaynor Knoll, sorry. And she's working full time. Her parents are looking after her children. And she's earning the £9.79. That's the difference between her not working at all and working full time. That's, you know, it's utterly pointless to doing it. She's missing all this time with her family. So the narratives they're telling are really devastating, but they're structured by the questions that are asked from the committee. They're not getting to necessarily do anything other than be sources of information. Whereas in the Wealthy External Forum, people are actually advising the government on how they'd like their tax affairs to run. So in conclusion, I'm going to be very positive now, or relatively positive. Let's not overstate it. It should be clear by now that this is an ideas book, not an answers book. It sets hares running and it doesn't necessarily chase them down. The manifesto that I top and tail the book with is more a set of solutions for helping to reveal the problem rather than a set of concrete policy proposals. We're governed, as Carol Backey says, by problematizations, by how a problem is represented. And until we successfully make wealth into one, manifesto statements and other promises will be doomed to roil around in the pre-policy making soup, as policy scholar Kingdon referred to it, and will fail to catalyse. But here today, I want to end by making a case for the timeliness and importance of ideas, especially now, especially in this political moment. Disruptive ideas, annoying ideas, contestable ideas. These ideas can contribute ways out to the state we're in. So first of all, we're increasingly good at describing distributions, and we now have the data to do that really well. But as the ideas introduced earlier attest to, wealth inequality isn't just a matter of distributions. It's about the capture of media and other knowledge-producing bodies. It's about the pernicious narratives that they participate in. It's about the way we are talked to and the knowledge we're allowed to contribute to or not. It's about our valuing or not by our more formally credentialed peers. It contributes to the community destruction and family destruction that bothers economists like Angus Dayton. Lack of wealth contributes to us feeling secure. It makes us resentful. We disengage from democratic processes. We become nativist. We vote for populists and autocrats. We become sad. Our health deteriorates. So many things. So what can we do? So despite being broadly policy agnostic, I am policy enthusiastic. I do think policy does have the power to change things for the poor and for the rich. So the few ideas that I've got finish my talk today, there are just 3 of them. I think we need more descriptive work. In the words of Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Dayton, we need to broaden out our descriptions and analysis. We need world-making descriptive sociology, as well as economics, if we're to better understand the problematics of wealth. We need the small measurements and the big discussions. And given that we know that the fact of very high amounts on their own won't ignite public anger towards inequality or the super rich, or foment support for redistribution, we need to find things that will. And we need to reflect this complexity in new approaches to measurement. What indicators do we need to develop? And that's a genuine question. I'm genuinely interested in responses to that. The idea that you should measure poverty just by looking at money seems to be nuts. That's Angus Dayton, the economist again, especially at this time when health measures are going in a terrible direction. So he's looking specifically at the US, where there's increasing suicide rates and what he and his collaborators call deaths of despair, despite rising GDP. So he's trying to work out what's going on there. I think we can say the same of wealth. So the conversation I was talking about earlier between Michael Sandel and Thomas Piketty, Michael Sandel says the moral underpinnings for progressive taxation and redistribution can't be detached from questions of identity, belonging, membership, community, and solidarity. So how do we recognise those? How do we act to make them more possible? How will we know if that's working? And finally, I was struck by something that Danny Sriskandara just said at his book launch here at LSE a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago. He said, we need to stop accepting the things we're told we cannot change and start organising to change the things we shouldn't accept. And this organising, this is me talking now, by the way, not Danny, close quote. This organising also takes place at the level of ideas. Ideas have the power to represent things back to us that we might have thought are inevitable and natural and make them problematic once more. They have the power to rebalance what we think is important and what we think needs political redress. So wealtherty is something we shouldn't accept. It's been made, we can unmake it. It's a political choice and other options are available. And it's in this spirit of organising to change the things we shouldn't accept that I present this idea to you this evening.
Rajiv.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the talk. Sarah, great opening talk. So I'm going to talk about 10 minutes about what I took from this book. So this is what we're all here for. If you've not bought this book, or go get it, it's a fantastic read and it's very thought-provoking. And I'm going to, as Sarah mentioned, it starts off with a kind of manifesto to move away from studying simply poverty and to what Sarah calls wealtherty. Okay. Full disclosure and a confession. I am a co-editor of the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice. So when I first read the book, I wasn't sure whether I should just pack up and go home and just forget it all. I'm not going to do that. But what I want to talk about is what I think the state of the study of poverty studies. I'll just say a few remarks about that to start with, and then move on to the sort of terrain that Sarah maps in her book. Now, as Sarah says in the book, poverty studies is a key part of kind of social policy research, and it's ably represented both in this institution and within this panel. So we're here at the LSE, and we've got some of the co-founders of the LSE, Sydney and Beatrice Webb, were involved in the birth of kind of poverty studies and the birth of social statistics. They took part in Charles Booth's inquiry into the life and labour of people in London. And these are the kind of famous poverty maps where they went out and charted different streets in London of the rich and the poor. The archives, funnily enough, is held at the LSE library, and you can actually see these maps. Actually, I'll come back to that right at the end, because even at that time, in the birth of poverty studies, if you look at the maps, there were areas charting where the wealthy lived. And this, I think, provides a direct link to the sort of research that Sarah points to. We've also got a representative here, Frank, from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And here again, based in York, we had the philanthropist, Quaker philanthropist and industrialist, and his son, Seaboy Rowntree, who also around the same time as the kind of Booth reports, studied poverty in York. So we've got a historical context to looking at the poor. And I still think that is definitely important. But what about the other side of the distribution? And this is the key point that Sarah makes in the book. There is a lot of work done on poverty studies, and it'll still be important. But what's also important is what do we focusing specifically on the rich. Now, remember, I mentioned about the kind of Booth maps. Even there, at the beginning, where they were looking at rich streets and poor streets, there was an acknowledgement, at least, that the wealthy lived alongside the poor, cheek by jowl, if you like. One of the quotations in Sarah's book is by R.H. Tawney, the ethical socialist, who made a famous statement in 1913. What thoughtful rich people call the problem of poverty, thoughtful poor people call with equal justice the problem of riches. Now, much social policy research has focused, as I said, on the poor and poverty studies. But what Sarah's book is trying to point out is actually we need to reframe a lot of this debate and think also about the rich. Now, over the past 20 years, within social policy research, there's been a kind of growing literature. Sarah mentioned some of the people, Karen Rowlinson, Michael Orton, Ingrid Robbins, who've contributed to this looking at the wealthy. And wealtherty takes this forward by mapping out a kind of manifesto of further research. And part of this shifting of focus involves looking at different narratives about the wealthy. I think we all saw images of the recent inauguration where some very wealthy people were on stage at the inauguration of the US president. And in a way that kind of symbolizes the kind of imprint upon how wealth and political power can enshrined. So if, as I've said, I'm not going to give up on poverty studies, what do I take from this book? Well, one key point is the importance of looking at both sides of the distribution. They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, in a way, that's a kind of banal point. But nevertheless, a lot of the kind of critical energy research has been done on poverty studies. And what Sarah rightly points to is there's a need for much more focus on the wealthy, particularly if poverty is a kind of symptom of something that's of something else that's going on elsewhere, and the impact of the very wealthy in shaping individual lives and structures. And so that's why, in some ways, just focusing on poverty alone sometimes treating the symptoms and not the underlying causes. So by extension then, or a corollary, more research is needed on the very wealthy. So what does this mean? Well, first thing is, well, how might this be understood? And I know Sarah's been doing work, and I think Mike Fawn has also mentioned they've been doing work funded by, I think, the Joseph JRF to do with narratives of wealth. How is wealth understood? Now, one thing about the poverty studies, like the Webbs, the Rowntrees, that they managed to get different definitions or metrics, if you like, of what is meant by poverty. But I think there's a corresponding need to develop something similarly for the very wealthy, because it's less well defined in terms of measurement, in terms of understanding what we mean by the very wealthy when we compare to the poor. So actually defining exactly what we mean by the very wealthy is a key area of research, and that's signalled in the book. And so one of the things that the book covers very well is different understandings of that. So that's kind of one area of research. There are individual kind of policy ideas, and there's a need for further research upon that. Now, Sarah mentioned, for example, libertarianism. This is the idea that there should be some sort of maximum limit. In kind of poverty studies, there's often a focus on things like minimum income guarantees, minimum standards of living, and so on. But the flip side is this idea of there should be a maximum limit, hence this term libertarianism. Other areas are the way in which the very wealthy can rely on various professional services, for example, to do with accounting and legal advice, to kind of protect their wealth. And the kind of jargon term for this is it's called the wealth defense industry. And so here we see the beginnings of different research agendas, but it's important to try to have a thread that connects them all and look at kind of both ends of the distribution. And then finally, I'm going to keep to my 10 minutes, don't worry, is for me, how might things change? Because it's, I think, defining what we mean by very wealthy, looking at different policies are important, but ultimately, it's how do you get change? There's no easy answer on that, but actually beginning to understand the scale of the problem, beginning to understand different narratives is an important first step. And that's why a book such as Sarah's just written is so important.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. And now over to Armine.
Thank you. Hi,
Yeah.
I'm around. So, congratulations, Sarah. I'm not going to use slides. I really enjoyed reading your fantastic book, and I learned a lot. It is definitely a book chock full of ideas. And what I like is how you provide an almost forensic analysis of how these actors, these think tanks, these governmental bodies work, not just to kind of create these narratives, but also to frame poverty and the poor, and you know, how they also kind of go about using evidence and knowledge so selectively. So I really like how you top and tail the book with the manifesto. I know you were kind of doubtful about that just a minute ago when we were talking. I think it's important to bring those bold ideas and to think about how do we disrupt the paradigms? How do we shift the focus and the conversation and research away from only looking at poverty and looking at what you call wealtherty? So I think that is an important kind of bold thinking. And of course, perhaps you wouldn't want this to be so timely as it is, but unfortunately it is very timely because of where the world is today, where the world's richest man has been given unprecedented free reign and access to review, shape, reshape, and transform government policy, not just in the US in the name of efficiency, but also, you know, what's happening in terms of US aid more broadly. And, you know, and there are the ideas that are driving DOGE or the Department of Governmental Efficiency. And while we might think those ideas are rather radical or extreme, they're not new ideas. These are the ideas, you know, from 40 years ago that were informing the work of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the neoliberal ideas. So I think the emphasis on ideas is important, and we need to think about whose ideas, which ideas are, you know, more powerful. And I think, you know, you do touch upon kind of the ideas of neoliberalism and the anti-governmental stance. And in fact, Margaret Thatcher's infamous kind of TINA, there is no alternative to austerity, which is, you know, kind of shaping and has shaped and continues to shape. So I think these are all important things. But two main things kind of stuck with me in your book, and I just want to highlight them and to kind of acknowledge them. The first is that you are very much, you know, thinking about ideas, but you're not thinking about ideas in a vacuum. You are bringing power. And, you know, the importance of kind of power and the relationship, knowledge, power, and ideas. And so, you know, Foucault's work here, and where he talks about, you know, power is not just about the capacity to oppress or to constrain or to limit, but it's also a productive force. So power produces things, it forms knowledges and produces discourses. And he looks at, and I think you do this in your book as well, about how the production of knowledge is shaped by a society's regime of truth. Like, what do we think is sayable and doable? And, you know, you do your own archaeology or genealogy of knowledge. And I thought that was really, really well done in the book in terms of unpacking and demonstrating what are the hegemonic ideas, what are the powerful ideas that, you know, shape our thinking, which naturalize certain forms of policies and actions. What is considered sayable and doable and rational, right? Because you may have people who challenge the status quo, and they're often written off as being irrational, illogical, and what they're saying is just a bit ridiculous or throwback to the past. So I admire the historical genealogy of wealtherty, that you went back to the 1700s, and you write, a genealogy allows us to look anew at things that we perceive as natural in our here, in our now. For example, that social policy is about poor people and poverty, and not rich people and wealth, and to recast them as outcomes of choices and actions in the past and our present. You add, they were made in the past, but we choose to reproduce them through our current practices and institutions. And I think that's so important, that there is an agency involved. There's that choice involved. So there is another, Rajiv talked about the body of work in social policy that looks at policy and poverty, but I think your work also contributes to an area of social and public policy studies that looks at ideas and the role of ideas. So I like Vivian Schmidt's work that looks at discursive institutionalism, and she writes, substantive ideas developed and conveyed by sentient agents inform policy-oriented actions, which in turn serve to alter or maintain the status quo. And I think what she brings to the foreground, as you do, is that while, we can all come up with ideas, it's again, whose ideas matter. And she writes, structural power, the ability of elites and powerful actors, is the power to also not listen. And I think that's something we need to remember. And if we link it back to the inequality studies, Piketty puts it succinctly in Capital and Ideology, where he says, inequality is neither economic nor technological. It is ideological and political, and the manifestations of inequality are shaped by each society's conceptions of social justice, economic fairness, and by the relative political and ideological power of contending groups and discourses. So I think your book does a great job of looking at what do we think is natural and normal, and challenging that and allowing us kind of to push our thing, kind of our thinking forward. The second key theme in your book that really struck me, and which I quite appreciate, is your work on kind of epistemic justice and the hierarchies of knowers and knowledges. And you provide a very nuanced analysis of, how this operates in different contexts, from HMRC's Wealth External Forum to the ironically named Center for Social Justice. And I think you bring to the foreground, this question of what is the relevance of epistemic inequality to other forms of inequality. And I completely agree with your assertion that epistemic justice is not something that we think about as an afterthought, but it's central to wider concerns about justice, about inequality. And your analysis focuses on whose knowledge matters, right, from an epistemic justice perspective, and talks about epistemic reputability, again, focusing on whose ideas matter and whose don't, and whose voices are silent and whose are amplified, who gets to be in the private room where photos aren't taken, and who is put on display and has to, kind of justify why they spent their money in the way that they did, and so forth. So I think, this is important. So to conclude in my last 2 minutes, I think I want to, ask you to reflect when we have the Q&A on the question of, you talk about ways out. We can think about it as ways forward, because diagnosing the problem is one thing and transforming it is entirely different. And I think you would probably agree with that. And your manifesto is certainly a start, where you give us ideas to think with. So I guess to me, the question is, well, who are the agents of change? How does change happen? What is the role of academics, which you've touched upon a little bit, of academia? What is the role of civil society actors, of social movements? Because, if we look at the literature on social movements and civil society, they often talk about social movements and civic actors as being those actors that can challenge the status quo, bring some creativity in society, that these are the fertile spaces where we question the dominant structures, discourses, ideas, and dare to imagine the unimaginable. But again, we return to the point of power, right? And who listens? You can, kind of say these things unless you're in the tent or in the institutions. Are your ideas going to be able to change things? And perhaps they do. And in fact, history shows that they do, but it takes time and over time. So perhaps it is again worth thinking about history and thinking about how much has changed, and not just what has sustained. And maybe that's what we need to hold on to in these dark and difficult times, that another world is possible. And reflecting, since we're in an academic space, about the role of research. What are the questions we're asking? And I think you end on this. Who is the research that we're doing for? Who does it help? And I think this is something that's really important, particularly in the Atlantic Fellows Program. That's something that I'm always challenged with, of who is all this research for? And perhaps we can be bolder in our thinking. So there we go. So I want to end by saying thank you, Sarah, for your brilliant book, for your excellent research, for inviting us to think more boldly, and also for inviting me to be a discussant of your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Armine. And now on to Frank.
So sometimes it's horrible going last, but I mean, that was such a great set of contributions, and I have a lot to riff off. So thank you, everybody who's come before me. I think it's probably just worth saying something briefly about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation before I sort of set out my remarks, because it helps with the context. So some of you might probably have sort of seen us mentioned in the press from time to time, and often journalists will talk about us as the anti-poverty charity. But 3 years ago, we refreshed our mission, and we talk about ourselves as a social change organization that's sort of seeking to help support and speed up the transition to a kind of more equitable world, one free of poverty, in which both people and planet can flourish. And I think that speaks to this kind of growing recognition that really, poverty remains like kind of very much at the heart of what we are concerned about, but there is something about thinking about the wider systems in which that's situated and the conditions for change that might need to be there for anything to really feel different on the ground. And so we have, over the last 3 years, sort of settled on 3 main routes to change. One of my favorite quotes about social change is that things happen when the powerful stop believing the stories they tell themselves. So a big tranche of what we do is around how do we sort of destabilize faith in the status quo. That's both among elites and politics, by shining a light on what's going on, such that it becomes hard to not listen and to ignore. But that can also be a route to fatalism. So alongside that, there does need to be sort of powerful propositions, alternatives that that provide a route to something better. Alongside that, we kind of look beyond the traditional power centers and seek to financially support those who are often in real life, kind of away from the public glare, sort of building the models of what a more regenerative future could look like. And then finally, and I think it's already come up in the discussion today, we are, although very interested in questions of material distribution, also very much focused on the question of relational justice as well. And so also supporting more participation where it's possible of people who are living with injustice into the kind of political process. And I say all that because essentially we have a house view about change, which is that profound social and economic change is highly complex, it's messy, it's emergent, and we need to have some humility about what we can know and what we can control. We also tend at JRF to accept that sort of change may happen through the accumulation of incremental steps rather than through any big leaps, and that it may be about the radical adaptation of existing systems rather than their complete demise. Though on wealth, I have to say, and this is a personal view, there is a kind of, at the back of my mind, a sort of question about you know, if you look historically, there is a pretty consistent pattern of the systems that give rise to extreme wealth eventually collapsing, and before the cycle repeats itself. And so there is for me a sort of general wonderment about whether one can, in fact, sort of steadily and thoughtfully transition from a society with extreme levels of wealth inequality as we have now to one that isn't, without some kind of major systemic breakdown in between. I mean, your book, I think, is therefore very optimistic because it's sort of predicated on the idea that we can. That's certainly where I hope we end up. And the book is brilliant. I have no doubt it's going to provoke a lot of fruitful conversations about strategy in various spaces in the coming months. I have to confess that initially I wasn't quite sure how to approach this event. Sarah and I have been working very closely with Michael Thorne as well on some initiatives over the past couple of years, and we agree on a lot. But her thesis does pose some quite deep challenges, as Rajiv alluded to, for large tranches of JRF's work. And I was kind of torn between wanting to defend some of what we do versus sort of building on her arguments. So kind of bear that in mind in what I'm kind of going to say next. So the book does actually start with an injunction at the start to kind of stop talking about poverty. And I just want to sort of say why we continue to talk about it and why we will continue to talk about it. And we don't do it to increase sympathy or drive donations. For us, it's about raising awareness and understanding. Ultimately, what poverty figures tell us is something important about how far, at any given point, our society is producing positive outcomes for everyone. And we try really hard to situate those trends within a kind of wider systemic analysis, not least in relation to the dysfunctions of the housing market, which is such an important force in driving material disadvantage in this country. Now, that's our intent. And probably, I would sort of say, as the person who kind of leads on a lot of this work in terms of getting it out there into the country, probably about a fifth of the population receive that output in the way it's intended, essentially as a comment on structural forces that need to be tackled collectively. However, Sarah's also really right in her book, which is that for others, the instinct on hearing about these trends is to use her words to look down rather than up. And the question is, well, why might that be? I mean, our own research into mindsets and narratives over the past 8 years tells us that we carry around very deeply coded ideas about human agency and fairness. You can sort of see even the development of children. They kind of begin with a very deep sense of basic equality. Every kid should get exactly the same. Then they're exposed to ideas of competition and just desserts come into being. So people evolve. And for some people, those balance of ideas tend to lead towards instincts that blame individuals rather than wider dynamics. And you find like these competing tendencies towards about individualism and structuralism are sort of present in large populations over time. Now, this isn't to deny that work at the narrative level is part of people's socialization as well and can influence those tendencies. We are, after all, mimetic creatures and tend to try to stay in line with the crowd and what the crowd thinks. My point is merely that the process of political socialization is highly complex, it's lifelong, though we know what happens in childhood and adolescence is especially important. And it's also contingent on people's real life experiences as well as the discourse they're exposed to. So to use a kind of analogy, if we think about public conversation as rainfall, we need to be attentive to the soil on which that rain falls. And I say this because it isn't immediately obvious to me, and it's sort of a question I guess I posed in response to the book, sort of how without that attentiveness to that process of deeper socialization, talking about more wealth inequality and less about poverty would avoid a similar dynamic in which some people who are predisposed to being concerned would be galvanized about the rise of the super rich and the breakdown of democratic norms, while there are others who are more sanguine and just naturally admiring of those who build great fortunes and wouldn't be especially bothered. I mean, and I suspect that quite a lot of people who, when they read stories about poverty and don't care, are also the same people who wouldn't care very much when they read stories about the very rich. So kind of understanding both the segments of that population who are the genuinely movable middle and what are the things that kind of trigger them is, I think, going to be a kind of key part of some of the political projects and the research that Sarah talks about. And this brings me to my second point. So the manifesto, and the thing that most excited me about the list of different ideas in the manifesto, the one that I felt was probably the most urgent if we were going to do something on it, was this call to shift a narrative to emphasize a collective welfare. And I do think that's going to be very important over time. One of the most troubling trends in public opinion research over the last few years is the growing sense of fatalism among citizens. In fact, next week, we're publishing a major study in conjunction with the Nuffield Political Research Center, which, among other things, will show the troubling extent to which people have lost faith in the social security system, not for ideological reasons, but because rightly they perceive it has very little relevance to their lives if their lives were to take a downturn in an instance of hardship. So if you lay that kind of finding alongside other data which shows a declining faith in politicians to achieve change, what emerges, frankly, is a kind of a loss of faith in the ability of the state to solve problems. And the simple truth is that politics and statecraft is actually just harder now than it has ever been in the past, because the problems are more complex. You know, we're not dealing with public health questions, how to like build better drains. Like the issues we've got left are like the really wicked problems. And the worry is that as politicians sort of struggle in voters' eyes to grip these contemporary challenges, plutocrats, by comparison, appear effective and more legitimate. So unless we can rebuild confidence in the modern state as an agent of general welfare, then I think this wider narrative that seeks to sort of center the rise of wealth inequality will sort of struggle to get traction. So it's not to sort of say that increasing the salience of wealtherty isn't a really good idea. I completely support it. I'm merely to make the point that this sits within a set of nested narratives that we're also going to have to be thinking about as part of this as well. I'll sort of stop there.
Thank you. Well, that was a fantastic panel and really interesting and important questions. Before we throw it open, do you want to respond quickly, Sarah, to any of the points raised by panel?
Yeah, I think so. It kind of ties in a few things. I think what you were asking, Armine, about where the change needs to happen and whether that might be civic action rather than political action. And to your point, Frank, around the kind of movable middle, which I'm increasingly losing faith in. And certainly the conversations, I entirely agree, the conversations that Mike and I had in the focus groups that we ran were deeply polarizing. And were people with very extreme views on kind of mild-mannered things like meritocracy. They hold them very dear and they're quite resistant to change, and people aren't mobilised, I would say, by extremes of wealth. They are mobilised by how it's used more so, and to a lesser degree where it's come from. But there's really high tolerance for very high extremes of wealth, even though they're really harmful. It's very hard to communicate that harm in a way that mobilises people. I think with where the action needs to take place, that if you haven't watched the conversation between Michael Sandler and Thomas Piketty, I really recommend it. It's sections of it on YouTube, and it's published as a book, a conversation between these two guys. And Michael Sandler's a political philosopher, and Thomas Piketty describes himself as a social and economic historian. Would delight me as a historian. But they were, Piketty was making a case for wage compression as the pathway towards greater equality, and making the case that we need the richest person in the company to earn 5 times the amount of the lowest paid one. So that's the idea of wage compression. And what Michael Sandler was saying is, if we don't change the civic spaces, we won't achieve anything good, and that we need to rebuild spaces to have conversations with people who aren't like us, primarily who aren't economically like us, because we live in increasingly income homogenous zones. So I think there's lots to be done at the civic level, and that picture of Salvatore Ray breaks my heart. But you just think it was also a moment of solidarity. I do think the secret current that comes through in our colleague Sasha Hillhorst's work. Sasha's done some deep ethnographies in Mansfield, in North Nottinghamshire. And Mansfield's, what you would assume is a kind of a Brexit voting, reform voting, ex-pit town, high levels of racism, etc., all the things, all the stereotypes that apply to that. Some of them are undoubtedly true, But what she's witnessed is a current of people seeking moments to show solidarity and to actually build bridges with people they hear narratives about that they hate and they don't want to spend time with and they don't want to build these bridges. People really do want to do that. So I think there is that hopeful moment as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we've got about a bit more than 20 minutes left for questions from the floor and from the online audience. By all means, raise discussion points as well as direct questions, and I think all the panel will have things to say. So let's try and take questions in batches of 2 or 3. Who would like, and when you ask your question, please just introduce yourself and your affiliation if you've got one. Who would like to start?
Hi, I'm Emer. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. It sounds fascinating. Everything I've read recently suggests that there's not only a gap in how much wealth people hold, but also the type they hold, that it's not incomes. In some cases, it's a lot of access and holding assets or capital. Do you think that has a meaningful impact on how the problem should be understood? And do you think there is any difference between categories of wealth holders, someone who's asset rich or someone who has, for example, created a business, but doesn't have massive amounts of pre-owned capital and wealth?
Thank you. Another question? Yep. Will over here.
That fast.
Thanks. Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation. Sarah, you touched on this, and Rajiv also, on the literature and the evidence around the causal links between wealth inequality and poverty, so the extent to which wealth inequality to some extent is a driver of poverty. Do you think, thinking about the negative impacts of wealth inequality, including the impacts on growth, on social cohesion, on democracy, where do you think the greatest opportunity is to either build or communicate the evidence base to increase public and political salience?
Thank you. Is there one more? Or yeah, but yeah, that's Malcolm is over here, so let's go over here.
I think one of the things that's so tricky about this issue is that we have this aesthetic of wealth, at least a lot of people do. And I think one thing that, wealthy people might say in retort to sort of social justice or wealth equality sort of advocates is, oh, you're just jealous, or, if you were in our position, you would want this too, right? What can we do to combat those narratives? And, what can we do? Is it, because there's certainly a lot of eat the rich content out there. We're not lacking for that. So I wonder, what we could do individually and then collectively to change the narrative there.
Okay, thank you. Some big questions there. Sarah, do you want to respond to those?
I can remember them. Yeah. So I think the types of wealth question is a really important one, and poorer people tend to hold physical wealth, which is basically the stuff you've got in your house. And the bottom 20% of people in the UK in terms of wealth spectrum have less than £100 in savings. So the kind of types of wealth people hold is consequential. And the richest people tend to hold financial assets, and the poorest people tend to hold physical ones. And the differences and inequalities arise in different types of wealth. So, Liz is here, Liz Mann, her research looks at, amongst other things, differences in pension wealth between women and men, which is hugely important. And women tend to have, I think, 90,000 less pension wealth at the end of the life course. So there's so much nuance in terms of the types of wealth people own. I think it is really important. And I think what's also important, and what the literature's been really good at since 2010-ish, is making the case for the difference between income and wealth, and income being more or less a flow of stuff, and wealth being a stock of stuff. And I know it's more complex than that, and there are different debates going on around that. But stocks accrue over time. And if you've got some now, you're highly likely to have some in the future. And if you haven't got any now, you're very unlikely to have them in the future. It's the kind of start of what some people have called an inheritocracy. So I think, we need to be alive to those differences in terms of what people own and the likely effects of
different external economic conditions on the state of those resources they've got. And bear in mind that many people have none. So I think they're excellent questions that we have to be mindful of. I think Will's question around causal links is really hard because I'm not sure people care at the moment. And I think, you know, many of us working in narratives might concur, people might have different views, which I'd be keen to hear. So in terms of building kind of narratives that will bring people on board, I mean, we've got a survey experiment with Michael and Annalena Oppel out in the field at the moment, which is testing some frames. And these frames arise from the focus groups we did. But we suspect that talking about the uses of wealth will be really helpful. People aren't at all supportive of tax avoidance, and they're not supportive of things that you call kind of non-pro-social activities. So things that very rich people do with their wealth that don't benefit anybody other than themselves. So I think narratives around use will be important, coupled with amounts, and to a lesser degree sources. So I think people are more accepting of earned wealth, you know, wealth that you've actually worked for, than unearned wealth. But there's a lot of support for inheritance because of the idea that if your family owns it, it's legitimate. So people do seem to be making a distinction between unearned being less good than earned, but still being legitimate if it's been passed between members of families, which is obviously deeply problematic for kind of future solutions to wealth, because it would be great to tax some of those massive fortunes that are going to pass between people. So I haven't got an easy answer to that. I think in terms of the aesthetics, one of the key things with campaigning is imagery. So, you know, there's such a lack of criticality with the images that are used to illustrate otherwise critical content and critical narratives on wealth inequality. You very often get a yacht or a shiny black car, a desert island, a handbag, something gold, something shiny, a white man looking out over the city from the top of the skyscraper. They're really cliche things that you could find in luxury brochures, and there's some really interesting literature on that. So yeah, I don't know what the solution to that is, but I think the reason why I used Lewis's book, Lewis Brush's image of the kind of images in here, is that we do need to push back on that. Wealth inequality doesn't look like an island with nobody living on it. It looks like assets extracted from that we've created that are common, you know, collective creations, etc.
Yeah, do any of the panel want to come in? Frank, you and your hand up.
Yes, just on that final question about aesthetics. There's been some really interesting work over the last few years as well to understand the psychology of wealth. And, you know, it's important to remember that when we talk about rich people, they aren't a homogenous lot. Like, there are some people who are very much driven by the need to acquire and hold wealth. There are other people who find a pain point in society, build a business around it, and then suddenly find themselves very, very rich. And there are lots of people in between, obviously, and people who inherit wealth and are asking themselves, what should they do with it? And they all probably come to it quite differently, but I do think there is something kind of interesting about the question of why do people feel motivated, not just to accumulate large amounts of money, but to feel like they have to secure the future, not just of their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren. And this is tied up, I think, with the nature of the state and the nature of distribution within the state, which is if you felt that actually there were some basic minimums and that there were floors beneath which nobody could actually fall, then maybe that kind of the stakes of building that deep generational wealth becomes less important. At least that's kind of my sense of it. So this is where kind of like how we think about the sort of social settlement alongside this is important, and why, like, it's not just the thing I've come to realize as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about narratives is narratives aren't just about words. Narratives are the sense you make of the world through your experiences of the world. So narratives are also about reality building. Like, unless we find ways to build public support for a better sort of social fabric than that people live through, then some of the attitudes that sort of fuel the desire to acquire wealth will continue.
Armine and Rajiv.
Thanks, Mike. I think, you know, to go to the point about jealousy, I think, you know, ultimately we are talking about kind of emotions here, right? About people being indignant with the status quo, feeling angry, and what are the emotions that prompt action? And how do you kind of access people's emotions? I think sometimes it's not academic books, let's be honest. but it is creative production, right? It is, you know, I always think about the film about the post office. I mean, that was a public issue that had been known about, but nothing was being done until there was this drama on ITV and people begin to, so I think, you know, and it goes back to the images. So it's not just about the still images, but it's those, you know, the films, the stories that get told and how they're told. But making those films, again, costs money. It's about, you know, kind of being able to tell that in a convincing way. And I think, you know, again, you know, I can't at the top of my head kind of come up and say, well, this is what you should say when someone says it's about jealousy. But I think, you know, not thinking that quickly on my feet right now, but I think, you know, there must be a way there, because it isn't about jealousy. It is about other things, justice and dignity. But yeah.
Yeah, so 3 great questions. I'll try to quickly just link them. As Sarah said, the point about different types of wealth is really important. And so actually for the very wealthy, they actually hold most of their wealth in financial wealth. And I'll come back to that in a sec. Whereas for most of the people in the middle of the kind of income and the wealth distribution, it's mostly property, you know, housing, essentially. But actually distinguishing the different types of wealth and the fact that amongst the very wealthy, it's mainly financial wealth, might tap into the questions over here. Wealth, I mean, what you call politely the aesthetics is kind of, it can be kind of viewed as kind of a standard refrain is that this is just a politics of envy. The really wealthy, we've worked hard, you just want to take away, and etc. So this points to the fact that it will always be contested, and if you're very wealthy, obviously you will push back against any attempt to kind of curtail your wealth. But then going back to Will's point, does that then mean that you just give up? No, because actually, if we think, well, I say, there was, over the past 10, 15 years, at one point, the symbol of the 1% became a kind of symbol of, this is unfair, why is this 1% dominating? And we've got to do something about this. That kind of 1% and the all Occupy stuff was linked, I think, at the time to the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And there's been some work being done that saying that actually wealth inequality might have been a problem there because most of the people, it was the kind of people who have financial wealth who then tapped into speculation that led to this kind of crisis and all this. And then we then live in a society in which 1% dominate over everyone else, which overrides kind of politics of, it's not simply a matter of politics of envy. So that's a way in which your point about distinguishing different types of wealth. The 1% was a particular symbol and a particular moment in time, but that doesn't mean something similar can't be fashioned now, which does acknowledge, yeah, sure, you've got to develop a consistent narrative, but just on the point when I mentioned all the kind of the Occupy and the 1%, that came from a particular point in crisis. There was a crisis at the time, and so often sometimes crises lead to opportunities for further discussion. And so do I think a narrative is possible? Yes. But so it's a question of making that kind of 1% narrative fresh today, which might link to the point about the 1% and also ticks onto yours. So I've tried to link all 3.
Okay. Great, thank you. We've got time for more questions. Everyone at the back here, I think. Oh, it's my line. Okay, sure.
Yeah, so the first online question is from Jerry Mitchell, who gives the quote, The task for the critical scholar is not to separate one struggle from another, but to connect them. How do those on the left apply Edward Said's words and Sarah's to organize at the level of ideas against wealth inequality and the associated rising tide of far-right populism? The second question is from Damon Taylor, who asks about whether the book can be a platform to focus on and celebrate replicable examples around the world of groups who are confronting this problem of wealtherty and empowering vulnerable communities.
Okay, is that may be enough, is it? We'll do it one more from the back there, perhaps, yeah? Yeah. While you're thinking.
Hi, I'm Gianmario Politi. I'm an economist. I teach in Nottingham, and now I'm affiliated to CP here. So I didn't understand from the presentation what is different, what is special in your narrative about wealth, because most of what you said could be applied to income inequality, and they're very different. To begin with, wealth inequality is much more persistent. It feeds, as Piketty says, it feeds on itself, transmits to generation. It's very difficult to undo. But your narrative, at least I didn't perceive the difference. Then there is the story about where it came from, right? So where this dynamic with this. So Piketty has a little bit of an ambivalence on that, right? He writes a book and he says R minus G. That's the structure, right? That's the structure of capitalism. He writes another book and he says it's ideology. It's culture. Okay, so it's one is Marx and another one is something else. My feeling is that you think that the root of the problem is a change in cultural norms. Am I right?
Thank you. Okay. So,
and I might ask you about that last one, Mike, because of the work that you've done on descriptive sociology and specifically looking at the fact that Piketty changes his mind. Why wealth, not income? I think, again, drawing on Mike's work, Inequality and the Weight of the Past, the title of which I was going to
Return of Inequality.
Return of Inequality. That wealth accrues over time in a different way, and it has a propulsive force into the future through inheritance, and it is stickier, as in it drags with it, I describe it as kind of dragging with it cultural norms and value as ballast. And it's so if you had wealth, if families had wealth 500 years ago, they're very likely to have it again now, as some of our colleagues at LSE show, in terms of like Irish wealth and other wealth that persists. So I think there is something particular about the fact that it endures over time, and particularly at the moment, the worry that it also propels into the future, that you're very unlikely to be able to access some, and it's so much more consequential for outcomes at the bottom as well as the top now. Jens Beckett and his team talk about this in terms of relevance. So given the parlous state of public and social services, wealth becomes increasingly important because you need to buy your security. You're, a trip to the dentist away from destitution. So its relevance and importance increases, and it becomes more important than income. So that would be my response on that front. I think, I don't know if you want to respond about Piketty changing his mind and the.
I think he does change his mind. I mean, I think I like the 2013 book, because the R is greater than G is a nice formula. It has this very pessimistic view that wealth just begets more wealth. And he does row back, I think, and say it's much more to do with political institutions. And I can see why he does that, because he wants to have this narrative. You can change things, it's not inevitable. But I think there's something simple about that earlier model, which I think it's good. It's valuable to keep that in mind, in my view. Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to pick up the question about coalitions, I suppose. But one of the things that is noticeable over recent decades is the declining connection between, for instance, class identity and voting preference. and other identities or experiences becoming kind of more important. And so in the same way that it's quite hard to get people to mobilize around being poor, I think it would be quite hard to sort of get people to mobilize around being non-wealthy. I think where struggle comes, it comes from a sort of shared experience of like particular aspects of the system, whether that's around tenants, unions fighting against landlords who are exploiting them, labor unions, obviously. And I know that there's a pull, particularly in Sarah's book, against that sort of fragmentation of the issue. And I think you're right to sort of point out the sort of threats of that. But equally, one of the things that it kind of goes back to Will's original question about causation that we have to come to terms with is we cannot put the rise of poverty purely at the feet of the 0.0001%. Like there are many more people in our society who are complicit in the systems. I would say it's like the upper 50% of the income distribution. It's the people who have their pensions invested in a system that requires more and more financialization, that extracts wealth from workers and creates more shifts risk away from households or sorry, onto households. So kind of how we sort of think about our own culpability in some of these systems is also really important. And it won't be pitchforks against like a few people in a fortress. I think it requires a different set of tracings of how our own positions kind of help fuel inequalities.
Any more responses to any other question, Sarah?
Okay. I think the point, and I think partly in response to the online question, and just picking up on Frank's point about coalitions, I think if any attempt, I think, to kind of craft a new narrative, I think might also involve engaging with the right as well, because I think it's simple, it's easy to kind of broadly look at the left and how they shape wealth inequality, but actually amongst the right as well, there's certain currents that are also ambivalent to some extent to wealth inequality. So if you take someone like Andrew Carnegie, who wrote a book, The Gospel of Wealth, industrialist, and he was against giving inheritances to his children because he thought it kind of undermined the work ethic, and also he had an idea of wealth having responsibilities, if you like, which also ties into R.H. Tawney's view about property having certain responsibilities and so on. Now, between left and right, there are different visions, and it's not always easy to make them compatible. But if I was to make one recommendation, I think in trying to craft the narrative is to look at those currents that also chime with the right, which also goes back to some of the points about wealth as an aesthetic, politics of envy. What currents might also tap in amongst that might chime with the right? Because if you're going to have a coalition against inequality, it's got to cut across the whole political spectrum.
Amina?
I was just thinking, this left and right, it's really shifting, right? I mean, some people, Elon Musk used to be a Democrat, and and some of the tech bros in Silicon Valley are left on certain social issues, but very right when it comes to tax and fiscal issues. So I think, the politics is quite complex, and so, putting people into like left or right is really difficult. It's about what can you mobilize people around and get buy-in, and I think that's a whole other event. But I think, these are things we need to think about and not perhaps, be locked into the binaries of left and right as if they are static.
Thank you. I'm going to give Sarah the last word, but before I do, I'm just going to point at this screen, because that's the most important slide there, which is if you want a copy of the book at half price, please scan that.
It's
code.
genuinely a good read.
Yeah.
But we're 7:30, but Sarah, do you want to have the last word?
Thanks for the question, Jerry. Jerry Mitchell wrote a really amazing book called Comfortably Off, which is precisely about the middle. And the argument she makes with her co-author is that we need to focus on people who are comfortably off in the middle because they're a significant group. And really shifting their opinions and moving them is perhaps a more fruitful way of looking at it than left-right. And I agree that that's become much more fuzzy, and certainly in the focus groups we did that were technically split economically left-right. We had reform voters in each group. You know, that things aren't as neat and tidy as they were 10, 15 years ago, are they? So yeah, I haven't really got anything to say about the photographs. I'm not sure I understood that question. I'm really sorry, but I'd be happy to respond kind of direct to that. But no, just thank you. Thanks for your responses. I've really enjoyed it.
A terrific book and a great panel. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Good stuff.